By first light in 1904, just outside Bangor, Maine, the skiff drifted back to the dock with no one in it. The hull sat low and heavy in the water, soaked through where it counted. Salt spray had crusted the gunnels. The seams wept. A dark tide mark ran high up the wooden planks where the boat had scraped itself home on the push of the current, and the smell coming off the planks was copper and brine the way it always was when the Atlantic had its say. But the lantern on the bow, the one Thomas Veer always lit before he cast off in the black hours before dawn, hung still faintly warm in the cold air. A man could feel the warmth coming off the glass if he held his palm close enough. And the net. The great herring net that only Thomas Veer was trusted to handle, the net that had fed every kitchen in that town for 16 years, lay coiled and perfect in the center of the boat, thick rope laid in rings like something sleeping. It was bone dry, completely dry. The wood beneath it glistened with seawater, the hull pooled with brine, but the net, the rope that should have been sodden and heavy and cold, lay there untouched, not a droplet on it, as if it had been sitting in a warm room all night instead of riding an open boat through high tide in the freezing dark. The men on the breakwater saw it first. There were always men on the breakwater in those hours just before the fishermen pushed out. They watched for the boats. They watched for the other boats too, the ones that belonged to the company men further down the coast who sometimes tried to work the waters off Bangor, Maine, where they had no right to work. This morning it was old Henry's and his grandson, and a man named Boyle who worked the timber camps upriver. They stood smoking in the dark, waiting for the coffee to be hot inside the shack. The skiff came in on a drift that made no sense. The tide was still rising. The current should have held it out another 2 hours at minimum. But there it was, moving steady and slow toward the dock pilings like something was guiding it with a rope nobody could see. The lantern swayed. Once, twice. The rope coils stayed perfect. Not a single knot had slipped. Henry's flicked his cigarette into the water and started walking. Thomas Veer was 43 years old. He had never missed a morning in 17 years. Not when his wife bore fever from infected teeth. Not when his daughter's cough turned her blue around the mouth and he sat beside her bed all night, praying to Mary and saints whose names he'd forgotten, then walked 2 miles to the dock anyway when dawn came, because the net had to go out, and the fish had to come in, and someone had to do it, and he was that someone. He lived in a house with a gray roof 2 streets back from the bay. His wife was named Catherine. She had waited for him every morning before he left, always in the kitchen with his coffee ready in a cup with a handle dark from years of his grip. She never asked him why he went out in the dark. She never asked him to stay. She had married a fisherman in 1881, and she had kept the terms of that agreement every day since. Their daughter Margaret was grown now, married to a man with a small grocery, living 3 towns over in a house Thomas had never seen. Their son, their only son, had drowned in that same harbor when he was 17, caught in a net that tangled his legs, and nobody understood what was happening until they pulled him up and understood everything. That was 20 years ago. Thomas Veer had never fished a single day after that without the knowledge that the water had his son in it, would always have his son in it, and that every morning when he pushed out into the dark, he was pushing out over the place where his boy had come to rest. He went anyway. He had always gone anyway. Henry's reached the dock just as the skiff bumped soft against the pilings. The old man's hand was shaking, not from cold, but from the certainty that something was wrong. He could smell it before he understood what he was smelling. Salt water and lantern oil and something else beneath it, something like metal heated and cooled fast, like the residue of a blacksmith's work. He stepped into the skiff. The planks were slick, but not from water. They were slick the way a surface gets slick when something wet and then left to dry leaves a film behind. Henry's moved to the bow where the lantern hung. He held his hand close to the glass, the way a blind man reads a face. Heat. Recent. The kind of heat that lingers. He took the lantern down and set it on the dock. The rope burns on his palm told him the glass was still warm enough to hurt. He turned and looked at the net. Perfect coils. Perfect circles of rope. He knelt down and ran his hand across the coils. The rope was warm. Not just warm. Warm the way a blanket is warm when someone has been lying under it and just stepped away. He knelt there for a long time. Behind him, old Henry's heard the voices calling from the shack. He heard his grandson asking what was wrong. He didn't answer. He was looking at the floorboards of the skiff, the boards where Thomas Veer always knelt to check the lines and make sure the knots were tight. There were no footprints there. There should have been a slick of water, a trace of movement, some mark of hands or knees. There was nothing. And the tide mark on the outside of the hull, the mark that told you how high the water had reached and how hard it had pushed, that mark was higher than any normal tide should have left it at that hour. That mark said something wrong had lifted the boat and carried it home. The men were calling louder now. One of them had seen the skiff come in. One of them was walking toward the dock. Henry's stood up. He looked out toward the open water where the eastern sky was beginning to pale. There was no other boat visible anywhere. There were no oars in the skiff. There was no Thomas Veer lying in the bottom bleeding or unconscious. There was no sign of struggle. There was only the impossible heat of the rope, the impossible dryness of the net, the impossible way the tide had brought an empty boat home, and beneath the dock, a sound that none of them would speak about for years, a low, steady knocking sound coming from under the pilings as if something wooden were bumping itself against the supports of the dock from below. Something that had weight and was trying, very slowly and very patiently, to tap its way back up into the world. By that afternoon, men from Bangor, Maine, were walking the breakwater in groups of 3 and 4, calling Thomas Veer's name into the wind. By that evening, they had tied rag strips to the fence posts that marked the edge of the pasture land, where the town's property ended and the rocky slope began. By that night, the women had gathered in Catherine Veer's kitchen with food they'd brought, and grief they didn't yet have the words for, because Thomas Veer had not come home that morning, or any morning after. The old hands in Bangor, Maine, the fisherman who had known his father and his father before him, they gathered in the shack down by the dock and told the younger men, "You don't go out alone before sunrise anymore. Not here. Not after this. Not now." Thomas Veer had woken at 4 o'clock in the morning like he woke every morning, his body knowing the hour without need of a clock. Catherine heard him move in the dark. She heard the scrape of his boots on the wooden floor. She heard him go down the stairs. She did not hear him come back up. At 4:30 he would have been in the skiff, pushing out from the dock with the oars already wet and the lantern already lit. The harbor at that hour belonged only to the men who worked it. The town was sleeping. The cold came off the water in layers. First the salt cold that hit your face, then the deeper cold that sat in your lungs, then the bone cold that reached down into your core and reminded you that you were made mostly of salt and water yourself, and the ocean was calling to its own. By 5 o'clock, 3 other boats were out. By 5:30, the sun still hadn't broken, but the darkness had started to thin at the edges, the way it always did, the way it had done for 10,000 mornings before this one, and would do for 10,000 more. Except this morning was different. This morning something would not come back. The other fishermen, the men named Walsh and Corrigan and Devereaux who worked the herring grounds off Bangor, Maine, they said afterward that they hadn't thought much of it when Thomas Veer's boat wasn't visible by 6 o'clock. The mist that morning sat low and thick off the point. You could lose sight of another boat 50 yards out if the fog decided to take it. But Walsh said something was wrong with the sound that morning. He said the harbor sounded the way it shouldn't sound. There was no rhythm to it, no pattern of oars in water and boats working the nets, the normal sound of work happening. There was just the sound of mist and water and the creak of his own boat beneath him. "I heard him," Walsh said later, standing in the shack with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "I heard his whistle, the call, the 2-note thing he did to mark where the net was going down, 4:30 or maybe 20 to 5. I heard it clear as I hear you talking now." Corrigan heard it too. Devereaux didn't answer when they asked him directly, just looked away toward the window. But the story that moved through Bangor, Maine, in those first hours was that 3 men heard Thomas Veer's whistle after 6 o'clock that morning. And by 6 o'clock, his boat was already back at the dock with the net still warm and no one in it. By 6 o'clock, Thomas Veer was already gone. Catherine came down at 6:30 looking for him. She had waited longer than usual because sometimes he came back up for a second cup of coffee before he left. She came down and found the kitchen empty and the coffee gone cold in the pot on the stove. She stood there for a long time. She didn't call out for him. She didn't check the yard. She did what women do in those moments. She waited. By 7 o'clock, when he hadn't come back, she sent their neighbor's daughter down to the dock to ask if anyone had seen him. By 7:30, word had reached the church. By 8 o'clock, the men had begun to gather. They didn't call it a search yet. They called it standing around and wondering out loud what could have happened. But by 9 o'clock, old Henry's had tied the first rag strips to the fence posts that marked the edge of the working grounds. And by 10 o'clock, there were 20 men with lanterns, even though it was morning now and they didn't need lanterns, walking in a line through the scrubland that rolled down toward the cliffs where the water churned against the rocks and nothing that fell there came back up. The dogs they brought, there were 4 of them, working hounds used to tracking scent across open country. They moved ahead of the men at first, noses down, moving confident the way dogs move when they know what they're looking for. But something changed as they moved past the 3rd fence line. The dogs began to slow. Their tails, which had been high and busy, dropped low. One of them, a brown hound named Copper that belonged to Henry's, simply lay down in the dirt and refused to stand again. When the men tried to lift him, he whined, a sound that didn't sound like a dog at all, but like something young and hurt and afraid. The other hounds began to circle. They moved in tighter patterns, no longer ranging out ahead but staying close to the men's legs, the way animals move when they've lost the thing they were tracking and want to stay in the place where the safe thing is. Something's wrong here, one of the younger men said. His name was Rourke and he'd only been working the boats for 3 years. The dogs know something's wrong. But no one answered him. They just kept walking, kept looking at the ground, kept calling Thomas Veer's name into the wind, the way you call for someone you know won't answer. By noon, they had covered the northern reach of the common land that belonged to Bangor, Maine, where Thomas Veer might have gone if he'd decided on impulse to walk inland instead of out to his boat. They found nothing, no sign of him, no torn cloth or dropped tool or mark of passage. They found an old boot that had been lying there for years, worn through at the heel. They found broken glass from a bottle. They found a child's toy, a wooden horse, half buried in the sandy soil. But they found no sign of Thomas Veer. By 1 o'clock, they turned and headed back toward the dock. And that was when Corrigan pointed to the fence line and asked whose rag strips those were on the eastern fence posts. Because when they'd walked out that morning, Henry's had only tied strips on the fence posts that marked the western perimeter. And these new strips, these were tied tight and neat, and they marked a line going deeper in toward the water, toward the rockfall where nothing grew and nothing lived, and where nobody from Bangor, Maine went alone or in the dark or at any time if they could think of a reason not to. I tied those this morning, Henry said, but his voice sounded wrong. It sounded like he was asking a question instead of telling them a fact. And then the younger men began to remember. Some of them swore the eastern fence line hadn't been marked that morning. Some of them remembered Henry's tying strips on the western side only. Some of them remembered him saying, "We'll come back this way if we need to, but nobody needs to go that way." And yet there they were, fresh strips, still crisp, tied in the knot that Henry's always used, the knot that took practice and time and intention to tie right. But Henry swore he hadn't tied them. He hadn't gone that direction at all. He had worked the western perimeter and come back the way he came. Someone else had tied those strips. Someone else had gone in that direction while they were walking the other way. Someone else was marking a search path in ground that had already been searched or marking something else entirely. The men looked at each other. Nobody wanted to follow those new strips deeper into the rockfall. Nobody wanted to see what they marked or where they led. That was when the sound came. It came from deeper in, past the marked fence posts, from the direction of the cliffs and the water below. It was a whistle. 2 notes, high and short, and the exact pattern that Thomas Veer used when he was marking the cast of his net on the open water. It came once. It didn't come again. The dogs froze. Every man stopped walking. For a long moment, nobody moved, and nobody spoke. Then one of the younger men, his name was Rourke again, the one who'd only been fishing for 3 years, he took a step toward the sound, and that was when Henry's grabbed his arm. "No," the old man said. His voice was hard in a way it never was. "Nobody goes that way. Not now, not tonight. Maybe not ever." They walked back to the dock in silence. They didn't mark any more fence posts. They didn't call out for Thomas Veer anymore. Behind them, deeper in the rocky ground past the marked posts, they left the footprints they'd made, and they left the mystery, and they left the rag strips that nobody had tied, standing in a line like markers towards something that had no name and no shape, but had a whistle that sounded like a man who was already gone. By the third day, the search had become something else entirely. It had stopped being a search for a man, and it started being a ritual that the town of Bangor, Maine performed because stopping would mean accepting that there was nothing left to find. Men came before dawn with lanterns, even though the sun rose early in that season. They came with ropes and hooks for dragging the shallows. They came with chalk to mark the spots where they'd already looked, as if the chalk would keep the ground from forgetting and erasing the search from its own memory. The women came too. They stood in groups near the dock with shawls wrapped tight around their shoulders, holding baskets of bread and cheese and coffee they'd brewed in the dark hours of their own sleeplessness. They didn't speak much. They watched the men work. Some of them looked out at the water like they expected Thomas Veer to rise up from the depths and apologize for the trouble. Some of them looked at Catherine Veer, who had taken up position on a bench near the shack and hadn't moved from it in 72 hours. She held her hands together, and her face held nothing at all. The foreman of the docks, a man named O'Brien who'd worked the boats for 40 years, he organized the search into sections. He drew a map on a piece of paper using a pencil and a ruler he'd borrowed from the church. He marked the water into grids. He marked the shoreline into grids. He marked the cliff face into grids. Every section would be searched twice. Every section would be marked when it was done. Every section would be searched again if they found anything that didn't make sense in any other section. It was methodical. It was the kind of work that men do when they don't know what else to do. And so they do the next logical thing and then the next logical thing after that, until they've done enough logical things that maybe one of them will accidentally reveal the illogical thing that happened. The younger men worked with the hooks, dragging through the shallow water near the rocks, pulling up seaweed and shells and things that had no names. The older men walked the shore with their heads down, looking for anything that shouldn't be there. The very old men, the ones like Henry's who'd been fishing since before the Civil War, they stood back and watched and didn't touch anything. They knew the difference between searching and disturbing. They knew that some things, once you touched them, changed the story they were trying to tell. On the fourth day, they found something. It was in the boat. The boat had been pulled from the water that first morning and hauled up onto the dock where nobody could miss it. It sat there in plain sight like an accusation. Men had walked past it dozens of times. Men had looked into it and seen only the coiled net and the warm lantern, and the impossible dryness where nothing should be dry. But on the fourth day, when Walsh went back into the boat to check the bench where Thomas Veer sat to work the oars, he found a piece of paper wedged between the planks. The paper was folded once. The paper was dry. The paper had writing on it. Walsh took it out with shaking hands. He unfolded it, and there, in the careful handwriting that everyone in Bangor, Maine had seen dozens of times, handwriting that had marked ledgers and marked receipts and marked the names of fish on the slates that hung in the shack, was a single sentence. Check the fence line past the marked posts. That was all. Check the fence line past the marked posts. The handwriting was Thomas Veer's. The handwriting was unmistakable. The handwriting was impossible, because nobody had been in the boat to leave a note after the boat had come back empty. Nobody had been anywhere to do anything after he was gone. And yet there was his hand. There was his specific way of drawing the F with a small loop at the top. There was the slight slant to the right that came from writing for 43 years, all of it telling them something that made no sense. Walsh brought the note to O'Brien. O'Brien brought it to the priest, Father Malone, who was standing with Catherine Veer trying to keep her from walking into the harbor. Father Malone took the note between his fingers, like he was afraid it might burn him. He read it once. He read it again. He looked at O'Brien and said nothing, but his face had gone the color of old paper. By that evening, the story of the note was moving through Bangor, Maine like a current. Some people said it meant Thomas Veer had come back to leave it. Some people said it meant he was still alive somewhere, leaving messages trying to tell them something. Some people said he'd written it before he went out and they'd simply missed it the first time they searched the boat. But that didn't make sense because they'd searched the boat thoroughly and the note would have been found. And besides, the paper wasn't old. The paper was fresh. The ink hadn't faded. The note looked like it had been written that morning, if not more recently. The older hands in Bangor, Maine, they told the younger ones, "You don't go past those fence posts. Not alone. Not at all. Not now. Not ever." They didn't explain why. They didn't need to. The note explained it. The note explained everything and nothing at all. The search went deeper. On the 5th day, men went past the marked fence posts. They went in groups of 6 and 7, not wanting to be alone, not wanting to face whatever it was that lived in that direction. They dragged their hooks. They called out. They found nothing. They found no body. They found no blood. They found no torn clothing or broken boot or any sign that a man had ever come that way at all. But they found something else. They found footprints in the soft earth, footprints that came from the direction of the water and moved inland, moving backward, heel first, as if someone had been walking in reverse, or as if someone had been dragged backward through the dirt by their heels, leaving long streaks and scuff marks. The footprints went about 20 paces into the scrubland and then stopped. They just stopped. There was no body at the end of them. There was no continuation of them. There was just the mark of heels in the dirt and then nothing. And standing at the end of the heel marks, standing upright in the soil as if someone had placed it there after the feet had gone, was one of the branding irons from the corral that sat 2 miles inland, used for marking cattle. It was identical to the iron that hung in the corral shed. It was clean. It was free of rust. And when O'Brien picked it up, not wanting to but doing it anyway because he was the foreman and that was what a foreman did, the iron was warm. It was warm the way the lantern had been warm. It was warm the way the net had been warm. It was warm as if it had been held in a fire and then set down gently on the ground just moments before they found it. There was no fire anywhere nearby. There was no way the iron could be warm. And yet it was. The priest came to see the iron. Father Malone held it at arm's length and then he put it down and made the sign of the cross. He told the men to fill in the footprints. He told them to cover the ground where the heel marks had been. He told them that some things shouldn't be looked at too closely, and some places shouldn't be marked and some events shouldn't be recorded in any way that might make them seem more real than they already were. By that evening, the iron had been taken back to the corral and placed in the shed where it belonged, and no one spoke about it again. By that evening, the mothers in Bangor, Maine, had begun telling their children that they were not to go to the fence line alone. They were not to go past the marked posts under any circumstances. They were not to answer if they heard their name called from that direction. The children asked why. The mothers didn't have an answer that made sense. They just held them tighter and made them promise and then held them even tighter when the children promised, because the promise meant the mothers were afraid too, and the children had understood. By that evening, the younger men were already refusing to go out fishing before dawn. By that evening, the older hands were already planning to leave Bangor, Maine for good, to find work in some other harbor where the water held only fish and not the weight of something impossible beneath it. And by that evening, Catherine Veer had stopped looking at the water. She had turned her face toward the town and kept it there, and nobody who saw her face wanted to see what she was choosing not to look at anymore. Weeks passed. Then months. The search was called off in October when the weather turned and the men had to choose between looking for Thomas Veer and preparing their boats for the winter season that would either keep them alive or kill them. Catherine Veer stopped coming to the dock. She stopped waiting in the kitchen with coffee. She began to look like someone who was waiting for something very different, not for her husband to come home, but for time to carry her far enough away from the morning he didn't. She lived another 12 years. She never spoke about Thomas Veer to anyone. She never answered when people asked her what she thought had happened. She would just look at them the way someone looks at a question that doesn't have a language to be answered in, and then she would turn away. When she died in 1916, the priest who gave her funeral mass said she had been a woman of great faith. Nobody asked what she had faith in anymore. The dock changed. The shack where the fishermen gathered in the cold hours before dawn, it was rebuilt with a wall on the eastern side that faced the cliff. The wall didn't keep the wind out. The wall was there for a different reason. Men didn't want to look out that direction anymore. They didn't want to see the fence line from where they stood. They didn't want the memory of it to arrive unbidden in their peripheral vision. By 1910, no fisherman from Bangor, Maine went out before full dawn. The practice of working the dark hours, the practice that had sustained the harbor for 200 years, it simply stopped. The older men said it was because the boats were wearing out and they couldn't afford to replace them. The younger men, the ones who had been there the day the search began, they said nothing. They just made sure there was always light in the sky before they pushed out from the dock. They made sure they were never alone on the water. Some of them left Bangor entirely and took work in other harbors, other towns, places where the water didn't have that particular weight to it. The fence line itself began to be repaired in ways that didn't make practical sense. New posts were put in even when the old posts were still sound. The wire was replaced twice a year even though it didn't rust faster there than anywhere else. The rag strips that Henry's had tied, they were taken down and burned, every single one of them. But sometimes people in Bangor, Maine, they still swear that new strips appear on those posts. Not often, maybe once or twice a year, always tied in the knot that Henry's used, always fresh, always leading deeper in, toward the cliffs and the rocks and the water below. When the strips appear, the men cut them down. They don't speak about it, they just cut them down and move on. But they move a little faster when they do. They look a little more careful. And at night, when the wind moves across that fence line, it sounds like something is tapping, slow and patient, from somewhere below the earth. People in Bangor, Maine, they began to tell the story differently as the years passed. At first, it was told as a tragedy. A man went out to work and never came back. Accidents happened. The sea took men. It was the nature of the work. But by 1915, by 1920, the story had changed. It was no longer about a man who drowned. It was about a boat that came back without him. It was about a net that stayed dry. It was about a note written in handwriting that belonged to a dead man. It was about the fence line that marked something that shouldn't exist in a normal world. And people began to have theories, the way people do when an event enters the space between memory and legend and starts to belong to both. Some said Thomas Vere had enemies. Some said he'd been taken by men who worked for the company further down the coast, men he'd angered or men who owed him debts. Some said he'd simply fallen and drowned, and the impossible details were just the town's way of making sense of a senseless loss. Some said the water itself had a hunger. Some said the fence line was a boundary and Thomas Vere had crossed it and the land past it didn't give back what it took. A few, the ones who were very old and who whispered it only to other very old men, they said it wasn't a man at all that brought the boat back to the dock. They said it was something shaped like him, or something wearing his face, or something that remembered how to tie his knots and knew the pattern of his whistle. They said that whatever came back wasn't him. They said that what went out that morning wasn't him anymore either, that something had taken him before he even reached the boat, that what everyone saw leave was already empty, already changed, already called by something that lived past the marked fence posts and didn't want to let him go. Nobody said this out loud in daylight. Nobody said it in the church. Nobody said it in front of the priest or the foreman or the respectable people who ran the town. But in the shack before dawn, when it was just the old hands and the young hands and the wind coming off the water, someone would eventually say it, and everyone would listen, and nobody would answer, and they would go out fishing in the full light of day instead of in the dark, and they would make sure they weren't alone. By 1925, Thomas Vere had been gone for 21 years. There were children born after he disappeared who grew up hearing the story as a legend. They heard about the warm net. They heard about the impossible boat. They heard about the note that nobody understood. They heard it the way you hear a folk story, not like something that happened to real people in a real harbor. But their mothers still told them not to go to the fence line alone. Their fathers still redirected them if they started walking that direction after dark. The schoolmaster still didn't let children play past certain boundaries. Generations began to change their habits around the absence of Thomas Vere, and nobody questioned why anymore. It was simply the way things were done in Bangor, Maine. New hands, when they came to work the boats, they got told the story on their first week. The older men would bring them to the dock and point out toward the fence line and the cliff beyond it, and they would say, "A man went out from here in 1904. He didn't come back. Some things came back instead. Nobody talks about it loud. Nobody goes out there alone. Nobody answers when they hear their name called from that direction. The new hands would ask what happened to him. The older men would say, "That's the question, isn't it?" And that would be the end of the conversation. The story lived on, not because anyone insisted on it, but because the town's behavior insisted on it. The town was the story. The town was a monument to something that didn't have a name and didn't have an explanation. In 1950, an old woman named Grace Hendricks, she'd been Henry's daughter, she went to the dock one morning. She was 84 years old. She'd lived her entire life in Bangor, Maine. She'd heard the story of Thomas Veer since she was a child. She walked to the spot where the boat had drifted back, and she stood there for a long time looking out at the water. One of the fishermen, a young man who didn't know who she was, he asked if she needed help. She turned to him and she said, "My father tied rag strips on a fence line in 1904. We've been tying them and cutting them down for 46 years. We've been telling the same story. We've been changing our lives around something we never understood. My father knew what happened. He knew something and he died knowing it, and he never told a soul." The young fisherman asked her what her father knew. She looked back out at the water. "I don't think he knew," she said. "I think he understood it wasn't something that could be known. I think he understood that knowing was dangerous. I think he was protecting all of us by not speaking." She walked away from the dock. She never came back. But the story stayed. And people in Bangor, Maine, people there still don't go to that fence line before dawn. People there still don't answer if they hear their name called from that direction. Parents still tell their children that some places are marked for reasons that don't need explaining. And sometimes, in the early hours before first light, fishermen swear they hear a two-note whistle coming from out past the marked posts. They swear they've heard it for more than 100 years. They swear the whistle sounds like a man who's trying to call someone home. But nobody goes to see. Nobody follows it. Nobody asks out loud what the whistle means or where the man is or why he's still calling after all this time. So here's the question that sits in Bangor, Maine, in the silence that nobody breaks. Which version makes sense here? That a man simply drowned in ordinary water, and the details are just memory playing tricks on fear? That enemies took him in the dark before dawn and left nothing but a boat and a story? That the impossible was real and something at the fence line reached out and took what belonged to it? And which version is it that nobody in Bangor, Maine dares to say out loud? The version that would crack the foundation of how they've learned to live? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.